Hello, welcome to RimTech Advanced EDRMS Training. Today, we're going to cover a brief webinar topic of EDRMS Project Management. My name is Bruce Miller, and I'm the co-founder and president of RimTech. So, as it turns out, for any EDRMS project, let's just get started and get this out of the way right away. There are two lethal threats to an EDRMS project. Three, if you're using Microsoft Purview. So if you're not using Microsoft Purview, then there are two threats. One is the failure to reach 85% classification accuracy, and we'll talk about that in detail later. And the second is the failure to manage case records properly. We'll talk about that later as well. So either way, if you make either one of those mistakes, I can pretty well assure you that your project will fail. And there's a good chance that you might go down with the ship. You never know. So if you're using Microsoft Purview, then you have the same two threats, but you have another one, which is the failure to deploy Purview properly. Purview is much trickier to deploy than the other four products, and you have to get three things right there. Number one is you have to be very careful in how you deploy case records. Number two is you have to avoid the apply label button at all costs. And finally, avoid retention conflicts. That's another training course. We won't be talking about that in detail today, not much detail anyway. So there are three things that you have to get right in any EDRMS project. And by the way, when I say EDRMS, I mean Electronic Document and Records Management System. Now, I'm referring to any modern EDRMS that uses SharePoint as its repository, okay, Microsoft SharePoint. So these are the three things you have to get right. First, you have to get SharePoint information architecture deployed properly. Number two is you have to manage case records properly, which in turn greatly affects the SharePoint IA. And number three, you have to measure and prove that you're above 85% classification accuracy at all times, 24/7. If you happen to be using Microsoft Purview, as I said before, then there's another thing you've got to get right, which is you have to deploy Purview correctly, okay? There's a lot of wrong ways to deploy Purview, but these three steps I've shown on the slide here will cover Purview and make sure you get it right. And we've mentioned those before. So what is this project all about? It's about compliance, meaning record-keeping compliance, which in turn means that all the documents or content you put into SharePoint adheres to the official retention schedule. So if your document happens to be about, let's say, expense reimbursements, then you need to make sure that it's categorized against the activity in the retention schedule called expense reimbursements, which might have a retention schedule that sounds like this, or a retention rule that says keep 5 years and destroy. If your document might happen to be about fleet vehicle maintenance, then there should be a business activity or category in the retention schedule called fleet vehicle maintenance. And it might have a retention rule that sounds like this. Keep 10 years after end of life of vehicle, then destroy. So the idea of compliance is that every document in SharePoint is properly classified against the retention schedule, meaning every document is tagged with one of those retention rules. And then later we can do a disposition, which is the act of deleting millions of records in accordance with that retention schedule. So the trick is, how do we do that? Well, let's get through some fundamentals first. Here's a cold, hard reality. If you present one document to 10 different users and ask them, is this a record or is it not? And even worse, if you ask them, where does this belong in the retention schedule? What's the applicable retention rule? Well, you know what? You're going to get 10 different answers. Okay? And the answers will change over time. Why? Because people don't care about records. They've never really done it, and it's work, and they don't feel obliged to do it. Even if they attempt it, they often get it wrong. Now, let's look at some numbers here. A typical modern electronic record keeping system gets 12 records a day per user. So if you were to have 1,000 users, you're looking at a daily flow inbound of 12,000 records per day. and that means typically 10 emails and 2 documents. So that's a horrific flow rate. And if you assume that the records manager, or anybody for that matter, wants to check them for accuracy or do anything at all with them, it's not going to happen. Because at that flow rate, you would need 25 full-time employees just to check every single one. So the conclusion is, where does the compliance come from? Well, let's figure that out. There's 2 schools of thought. One says end users, that's where compliance comes from. It's their responsibility to decide what documents get what retention rules. And they in turn will determine your compliance because they're the ones picking the retention rules. That's the old-fashioned school of thought. The newer one is no, we don't ask people to manage their records. We impose compliance on them. We, the employer, decides this is the retention for that document, and that's it. You don't have to like it, but it is what it is. Okay. So, of those 2 approaches, which one is right? The first one, which is imposing compliance on the users. It's absolutely the only way to do it. I've seen way too many projects where we're counting on the users to do this and it just doesn't work. And I've never seen it work and I never expect to see it work. So the conclusion here is that we're going to have to automate somehow. Fortunately, the 5 records management software products shown on the screen here in this box on the left, these 5 products right here, they all offer full automation, which is what we're going to have to use to make this project work. So in any EDRMS project, irrespective of whatever one of those 5 software products you choose, you have to go through 6 steps. I'll give you a rough overview now, and the rest of this session is about the details, and then we will revisit this diagram later. So first, you have to define a retention schedule. Well, you already have one. Yes, but it won't load into the software. Now, when I say the software, I mean one of these 5 products, the record-keeping software. To keep this in mind, SharePoint does not and never will manage records. Let me repeat that. SharePoint does not and never will manage records. You have to use an external piece of software. Even if it's Purview from Microsoft, it's an external piece of software, and you're going to have to use that software to manage your records in SharePoint. In other words, to manage the content of SharePoint. So your retention schedule is going to have to be machine readable so you can load it into the record keeping software. So that's what we mean by define, or maybe I should have said redefine the retention schedule. Once you've got that job done, then you have to generate it. You have to produce it in a format that the record keeping software can accept. And then you have to load it into your record software. So in a typical medium-sized EDRMS deployment of, let's say, 1,000 users and maybe 800 categories in the retention schedule, you're going to have 800 categories in the retention schedule to load into the record software. Now, you don't have to load it in. You can type it in by hand. It just happens to be a lot faster to import it through a spreadsheet, from a spreadsheet, okay? But the big story here is that you're going to have to restructure your retention schedule. You don't have to throw it out. You don't have to rebuild it from scratch. The rules are intact within it, but it's restructured so that it's machine actionable. Step 4 is you need to define the SharePoint Information Architecture, the IA, which means where do we store our documents? How many libraries do we have? How many sites? What metadata or columns do we need? That's what the IA means, and you have to have a predefined IA in order to support the use of any one of these 5 products, okay? So you've got to figure this out, and that's a lot of work. Potentially that could take years, but we're going to target here 800 libraries, and if we have an average of 14 metadata fields or columns per library, which is normal for an EDRMS, that means 11,200 columns, okay? So that is an instruction manual or a blueprint for deploying SharePoint, because as you know, SharePoint out of the box doesn't do anything. You have to build and define those libraries, those sites, and those columns. So step 5 takes this spreadsheet, which contains the definitions of your 800 libraries 800 content types, 11,200 columns, and you have to build them. There's two ways to do it. One way is to do it by hand, which is a traditional way. That could take you months, but we'll show you a faster way. When you're done, and only when you're done, can you tackle step number 6, which is now we can put the record keeping software to work. You have the two ingredients. You have the retention schedule in and running in the record software. Number 2, you have your SharePoint information architecture structured properly to support the software. And now you can automate it with rules. You automate it, the whole record keeping process with rules that run in the background. And basically they work like this. They say for this library and for this content, apply this retention rule to them, okay? And those rules run 24/7 in the background. But you cannot do step 6 until 1 to 5 are complete. So that's a really high-level overview. Now what we're going to do is we're going to dig a little deeper, and we're going to look at some particular aspects of it, and then we'll tie it all together with project management, okay? So this is one of the first things we have to tackle is case records. Now, case records is poorly understood, very poorly understood, but it's over 60% of your records. So the record keeping software treats case records completely differently than admin records, which are non-case records. And the fact that you have so many case records will have a profound effect on how you deploy SharePoint. Case records are records about a person, a place, an event, or a thing. The business activity is a series of repeated adventures that end. For example, contracts. A contract has a start date and an end date. Employee records, a start date and a termination date. A project, a start date and an end date for each project. So if we imagine 10 projects or 10 audits in a year, each project or audit generates a set of records unique to that adventure and separate from that other adventures in that activity. Okay, so the goal is to keep the records from one adventure or case apart from the others. So if you have 12 months in a year, one project per month, then each project will generate a set of records unique to that project. Okay, you have to keep them separate. The opposite of that are administrative records, which don't have any separation by adventure. They just continuously appear constantly over time. The business activity is pretty constant. There's no real start and end date. Okay. Now, one of the secrets to EDRMS and SharePoint is document sets. A document set is a mechanism or artifact inside SharePoint where you can store groups of related records together. And in our world of EDRMS, a group of related records means a case. So this is an example right here. The screenshot is an example of a library for competitive procurement. And in it are 6 document sets shown here in red. And each of those document sets is a case. So if you imagine we have 800 categories in our retention schedule, then that means 800 of those categories in SharePoint would have to be subdivided into document sets, which we'll get to in a minute. So here's a very high-level look at a hypothetical deployment. We have 250 admin categories in the retention schedule and 3 case categories. We have contracts, employees, and projects. And each of those 3 case categories has 1,000 cases. In other words, we have 1,000 contracts, 1,000 employees, and 1,000 projects, okay? Each of those 1,000 generates records, and the records have to be kept separate from all other cases. So this means that out of our 12,000 records a day flowing into SharePoint, we have 3,250 different places for them to land in SharePoint, okay? That's what an EDRMS means. Case records have to go in case places. Non-case records have to go in non-case places. But at the end of the day, we need a lot of places. So let's look at that architecture. We're going to make a 3-layer system here. The retention schedule forms the base. SharePoint is the workhorse. And then on top of it, orchestrating the whole thing, are rules-based record keeping rules. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to use the one-to-one-to-one approach, which means that one category or business activity in the retention schedule equates to one SharePoint library of the same name. And in that library, we have a document a content type of the same name. The content type is a container of columns or metadata fields unique to that library. So on the right, you see two examples, safety and contracts. Safety is an administrative category. The library and the content type are called safety. But in the case of contracts, same deal. The library is contracts and the content type is contracts. However, this library is divided into 1,000 document sets, one for each case. So at the end of the day, let's pretend again that we have 800 categories in our retention schedule in green on the bottom. 60% of those are case, which means 480 are on the right, and the retention rules are applied to cases or groupings of related records. Meanwhile, 320 of those categories are on the left. They're not subdivided. The retention rules are applied directly to documents. Up in SharePoint, we now have 480 libraries on the right, divided into document sets. And we have 320 on the left, and those libraries are not divided into document sets. There's no cases going on. However, each of those 800 libraries has an average of 14 metadata fields. So if you multiply 14 by 800, you end up with 11,200. Now that's not 11,200 unique columns. That's 11,200 column usages within those libraries. And by definition, each library will have a set of metadata unique to that library, meaning it's different from the other 799. Otherwise, it doesn't need to exist. So now we have our 800 categories on the bottom, 800 libraries in the middle. Now we move up top and we automate this thing using one of those 5 pieces of software. What do? We create 2 piles of rules, 2 groups or categories of rules, okay? One are retention rules. Example, keep 5 years then destroy. Example 2, keep 5 years after end of life of asset, then destroy. Okay? They're retention rules, and there's probably no more than 2 to 300 at most. The second set of rules we need to create are called content rules or automation rules. And those rules say, for this content in SharePoint, apply this rule from the pile of retention rules to that content. For example, if the library equals operator rounds and the field approved contains the value yes, then apply the retention rule 10 years and destroy, okay? So that's what the rules kind of look like. And I thought I'd show you an example from real live software. This is the Opus software from AvePoint in New Jersey. So this is what it's like to enter one of those content rules. You basically have the name of the field or the column, the operator, which is equal to, greater than, less than, and then the value. And then it applies a term to that content. What's a term? Well, in Opus, a term is a retention rule. That's what they call it. Okay. Here's another little more sophisticated screen, but it shows again that you're picking the name of the column, what is the operator, and then what value that must that field contain, and then you will assign a term to it. Okay. So all 5 products are basically the same. Purview is a little different, more complicated, but it's the same principle. Okay. So now take a look at the diagram one more time. What we have here is we have an average of 3 content rules per category or per library in SharePoint language. That means we're going to create 2,400 of these rules, which is quite normal. So those rules, however, contain the names of the libraries and the names of the metadata fields, the columns. So if you disturb the library or change or delete the libraries or library names or the columns, the rules break and you're no longer compliant. So what does this mean? Well, this means that the system has to be static. Once it's built, don't touch it. Don't disturb it because it's working and it's compliant. So it has the effect, these rules have the effect of locking together all three levels, all three components of this model, like tightly together, like Lego blocks. And that's what it takes to make it compliant. All users have to do is put the right documents in the right places, which is very easy to do, and the retention is automatic. Okay? So what does this look like in the real world? Well, I thought I'd show you a really, really simplistic example, the most simple example I could possibly come up with. And here it is. This is a system that we use for demonstration purposes. And this is a SharePoint landing page. And we have 3, 5, 7, we have 9 activities. And all the user has to do is to say, my document belongs here into board elections. That's I got an email or a document about board elections or about competitive procurement. So here, if it's competitive procurement, that's a case structure. So that means that you have to pick one of the competitive procurements, plural. Each procurement is an adventure with a start and stop date, right? So here is an example of um, 6 sample competitive procurements. So the user has to pick the right library and then the right case. And down here, when you dive into one of those cases, you see documents. So here we have a bucket truck procurement with 3 documents in the library. Okay, so that's all fine and well so far. Now, how do we remember we said there's a few things you have to get right. You have to get the architecture right. We've covered that. You have to get your case records straightened away and managed properly. We've got that covered. Now we're going to ask this question. How do we prove that this thing actually works? Well, here's how. We're going to prove that the percentage of documents that are classified against the retention schedule are 85% accurately applied and not less. And we have to do that every single day. Why every day? Because we're getting 12,000 records in per day. And if you let a day go by and you make mistakes or you want to check it or you need to fix it, you can't. You're going to have to take 25 person days just to check it or test it for one single day. Just imagine if you let this go on for a year and then you decided to check up and see what your accuracy rate is. No matter what it is, you will never fix it. It is impossible, even after a single day of usage. So we're going to use modern statistics to figure out what the classification accuracy rate really is for one day. Because if we did it manually, we would need 25 days of work to test it. We don't have 25 days. We have more like 20 minutes or so. So this chart shows that if we had 6,000 records a day and a 50% error rate, you would need 13 employees just to fix this. That's not a fixable problem. There's no way you can check 6,000, let alone 12,000, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to go out to the internet and find an online sample size calculator, because what we want to do is we want to make samples only, test samples, and find out what that classification accuracy rate is. And if we use these scientific methods of statistics, then we can be 95% confident that the number we measured is correct 19 times out of 20 with a 5% plus or minus error range. That's what we want. And it turns out that if we were to say, let's say 6,000 records, we would need 361 measurements. How long would that take? Well, we estimate 1 minute per document on average. So that would take 361 minutes, which is 6 hours. Okay, still too much because we don't have 6 hours available. So what we would do is we would farm that out. Let's say we had 10 departments, 100 people each. We would designate someone in each department to do this, which would take them 36 minutes. Okay, and they would bring up the document on one screen, the retention schedule in the other, and they would measure 36 of them. And if they were to find that, let's say that 18 were right and 18 were wrong, then that's a 50% classification accuracy rate. So these samples have to be taken each and every working day, okay? And then each of the 10 departments would send the results to the records manager and you'd get your average overall. Now, let's interpret the number. If you hit 85% accuracy, which is the target minimum, then that means mathematically that it could be as low as 80% or as high as 90 because of that plus or minus 5% window. So really the target number we're actually shooting for is 90%. So that way it could be as low as 85, worst case, best case 95. That's the number you really want to shoot for, okay? And in a properly deployed EDRMS, that is not a problem whatsoever. In fact, it's be quite easy to do. So now, this is the deployment process that we looked at before. It doesn't change at all depending on which software you buy. Okay, you still have to go through these 6 stages, but each stage can take years, certainly months, and a lot of money. This can go on for many years, and the larger you are, the longer it goes on. It can be horrifically expensive. So what we're going to do now is we're going to crack open the project, look at all the individual steps, and then at the end, we'll look at ways to make it go faster, okay? The spreadsheet you're seeing here is what we call a feeder spreadsheet. This is an estimate of the atomic elements of the project, such as if I look at a document, how long will it take me to figure out if it's a record or not? How long will it take me to interview a business unit owner and determine what they do so I can create a category in the retention schedule? How long will it take me to figure out appropriate metadata for this category? All of those atomic numbers are put into this spreadsheet, and there's actually 2 sheets, this one and this one, okay? And look, that's the individual micro task number of minutes. We use that to feed the EDRMS project model. The EDRMS project model is a pretty sophisticated spreadsheet that has all the resources, all the tasks, how long it'll take each task, what work is done, and who has to do what work, and the cost and the timing of all that work. It's a complete comprehensive EDRMS project model. It won't fit on the screen. This is just a screen capture, but I'm going to bring up a live one now so we can take a look at it. But those 2 sheets you saw a moment ago are the atomic numbers that are fed into this sheet, which then in turn calculates your project effort level. So let's go into this and take a look. This is the first tab in the multi-tab spreadsheet. So this is the resources for the project. In blue here are the resources of your organization, your internal resources. You may have all these roles, you might not. But the one that matters is this one, your EDRMS project specialist. So who's going to drive the bus, so to speak? Who's going to run this project day in and day out? Then you're most likely going to need a SharePoint services provider to build you, to get SharePoint up and running, to build the information architecture, to do the navigation, any branding, that kind of thing. Then, if you so choose, you can use a consulting firm like ours, shameless promotion there, to help guide you through the process. And then you're going to need a vendor of one of those 5 pieces of software. And they're going to have to train you how to use their software and so on. So these are the 1, 2, 3, 4 actors in this play, right? These are the 4 groups of resources. And some of those resources are billable per diem, so we show their estimated rates over here. Now we come to the task details. It turns out that any EDRMS project, regardless of what software you purchase, will have roughly 9 what we call foundation tasks. You can't avoid them. We call them foundation because they're independent of whatever software you buy. This is work you have to do up front to get ready for the software so it'll work properly. And then you have, starting with I1, we go up into the 20s here, right up to 27. But roughly, on average, 27 steps that you have to do once you've got your software. In other words, the 27 implementation, that's what the I stands for, implementation. The 27 implementation steps are software dependent. They're specific to whatever software you purchased. Okay. We're not going to get into that level of detail of reading this out today, but we're going to summarize right here. Now, this is the core, this is the beating heart of your EDRMS project right here. Okay. And it's a simple matrix. It has the 9 foundation tasks here, the 27 implementation tasks here, and it has the actors, the widget, your organization, the SharePoint services provider, a consulting firm such as us at RimTech, and you have to go get some records management add-on software, and that comes with the vendor. So those are the 4 actors in the play. And each of these cells here is an estimate of how much effort in person days each actor needs to contribute to that particular task. So let's take a look at this one. Retention schedule finalization. What is that? Well, we'd have to go back to the details to find out. Over here, right? Retention schedule finalization. So this explains in detail what it is, but in summary, it's topping up or finishing off your retention schedule so it's machine ready to load it into the record software. So we estimate here, for example, there would be 4 days of work for the EDR. And who's the EDR? Well, the EDR is this person right here, the EDRMS specialist, who's going to be the bus driver, shall we say, the project manager going forward. Okay. 4 days of their time, 1 day of business analysis time, 1 day of business analysis time from the SharePoint services provider, and up to 3 days from a consultant like us. We would be teaching you how to finalize that retention schedule. Okay. And that's it. So the total over here is 9 days of effort across the 3 actors for that one task. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is just really high level walk you through, yeah, all 36. Okay. So be prepared here. So I'm just going to give a 1 or 2 sentence summary of each one of these just to paint you a picture. And what I'd like you to keep in mind when you're going through it is, are any of these unavoidable? And I hope you agree the answer is no way. They're all essential to any EDRMS project. So here we go. We've got to get the retention schedule restructured. And by transcribing it, we mean we have to get it in writing in a spreadsheet in a form the software can accept it. Legal citations. If you don't already have your citations in your retention schedule, now's the time. Then we have to load that retention schedule into the record keeping software. Now we need metadata in SharePoint. So how do we do that? Well, what we do is we do not ask the users what metadata they want. That takes way too much time and money. So what we do is we take each of those business activities and we propose the metadata. We think we know what the metadata should be. So we present that to the users and have them validate it for us. Then we need to, once validated, we need to have all that metadata. And remember, we're talking 14 columns times 800 categories, which is 11,200. Now, 2 points to make. Number one is that's not 11,200 unique columns. It's probably between 500 and 1,000 unique columns, reused or used 11,000 times, okay? Second thing, no, I know what you're thinking. The users do not have to enter 14 metadata fields, rarely, if ever. The average number of fields they have to enter is 2.1 out of the 14. So in task F6, we are building a sophisticated spreadsheet that can be loaded into the record-keeping software. Now, in task F7, turns out that about 20% of all metadata fields are populated with a list, such as the buildings you have, such as the names of employees, a list of perhaps of the authorized auditing firms that you use, and so on. So where do these lists come from? From the business users. You have to go get them and put them in a spreadsheet, load them into SharePoint. That's what's happening in task F7. And of course, in F8, you know what's going to happen, right? Each business unit is going to say, well, I want only these people to see these records. That's fine. We'll just call that security. F9, common and shared libraries. We won't be explaining that today, but not in detail anyway. But those are libraries that are universal, but people don't want to share their records with other people. So we duplicate the libraries in each business unit. We call them common libraries. So notice we're at the end of the foundation. That means that everything we've done so far has nothing to do with any record software. It's universal, okay? Now, what we're going to do is buy the software, and once we have it, we can do these 27. So project management is project management, right? Weekly meetings, a lot of people involved. Now, the SharePoint information architecture has to be designed and built and deployed. So that again is 800 libraries, 800 content types, 11,200 column assignments, and 1,000 unique columns. Who, how, when, and where is going to build all that? Well, this is what you've got to define in task I2. I3 is usually not followed. Usually good intention, but rarely followed, which is change management. How do we encourage users to use this new approach going forward, and how do we ease their transition to it? Now, remember, 60% of all records are case records. That means that when a user goes to put a document in the library, they got to put it in a case. Which case? Well, there has to be at least one case. So that's a document set in SharePoint, but someone's got to create it. Otherwise, there's nowhere to put a document. So that's what task I4 is, creating the initial cases. Then, what's the user interface going to look like? Well, you've seen one already. I've shown you that slide, that screen capture, where each library is presented as an icon on the middle of the page. Simplistic, but effective. But somebody has to define and build that user interface. What does it look like? How do I navigate among business units and among sites? Teams, you can't get away from teams. There will always be teams, and we have to connect the teams to the governed SharePoint architecture. Now, the Records and Information Manager, what we sometimes call the ERS role, they're the key player here. They have to babysit this system going forward and operate it every day and keep it healthy, including measuring it. But they have to get trained on the record software, but they also have to get trained in SharePoint, because what few people realize is that in order to use the record keeping software, you have to know 6 aspects of SharePoint inside out, admin level, such as creating libraries and columns. Okay, there are 6 aspects of SharePoint that they have to master. And here in I7, that person has to be trained. In I8, we're going to install the record keeping software. That's usually done by the vendor, as well as I9, which is to configure it to client requirements, such as security levels, who are the accounts, what's the name of the company, and so forth. And in I10, we're going to take the file plan, which we modified up top in the foundation, and we're going to actually import it into the record keeping software. Okay. In I11, we're going to define the rules-based record keeping. That's the 2,400 content rules. We're going to define it, and later on, we'll configure it in the software. If you're doing PRM, physical records management, then that's a feature of the record keeping software. So that has to be set up with locations, box definitions, barcode labels, and so forth. And we might even have a legacy set of physical records to import in task I13. I14, we're going to do some custom reports. And in I15, finally, the records manager is going to take some formal training to learn how to use that record keeping software. And what they'll discover, if my experience is anything to prove, is they'll discover that training is not all that great. The vendors, that's not their strength. So they might want to, well, they have no choice. They have to take the training, but afterwards, you're going to have to do a lot of self-learning. Okay. And that in turn leads to I-17, which is what we do a lot of, which is coaching. We help you learn. We know these products. We know their strengths and their weaknesses. We know how to put them to work. And that's what I-17 is all about. We can coach to shorten the pain and shorten the time of that learning cycle. In I-18, what we would typically do is integrate email, meaning Outlook, with SharePoint. And that's typically done through a third-party software product such as Caligo out of Vancouver, or Harmony out of Boston, or RepStore out of Ireland, or one of those products, and highly, highly recommended. So the way these products work is you can be in Outlook, and there's a window pane on the right-hand side of the screen, and you can drag and drop email directly into SharePoint from that screen. Why do we need that, you ask? Because get this, 4/5 of all modern digital records are email messages. 4/5. So how do you propose to get them easily into SharePoint? Right? That's how. I-19, legacy document migration. If you have existing documentation on your file share or Teams or OneDrive that you need to bring forward into the system, that's called a migration, and that's what happens in I-19. I-20 is testing, 21 is documentation. Now, documentation of what? It's documentation of the record-keeping administrative procedures, nothing else. We call them SOPs, standard operating procedures. How to create a new category, how to create a content rule, how to carry out a disposition, and so on. But doesn't the software documentation tell you that? Yes. Is it good enough? No. Documentation is beyond poor. It is abysmal. Particularly for Microsoft Purview. So we have to make up for that. We have to write proper definition. And furthermore, the documentation in I-21 is going to be specific to your particular implementation, how it is unique with your unique retention rules and retention schedule. Okay? I-22, the IMA, Information Management Administrator. Those are people embedded in departments that have 7 duties reporting to the records manager, EDRMS project manager. Okay? 7 duties. I could name them all off, but I'll just tell you a couple. One is creating new cases, and the other is conducting these daily measurements to prove classification accuracy. Okay? So they had to be trained in I-22. In 23, we're going to train users, okay? But we're not ready to train the users until we write the training material or content. That's what 23 is. 24, we're going to set up a training system with that content, with scenarios. And in 25, we're going to actually train the users. Now keep this in mind. End user training has nothing to do with records management. Why not? Because in any proper modern EDRMS, users don't interact with the record-keeping element of the project. They will never see or experience the retention schedule or the record-keeping software. So what are we training them in I-25? SharePoint. How to get documents into the right places in the right manner. Teach them what metadata is, how to use it, why it's important. And in 26 and 27, we're going to conduct a pilot or proof of concept. So that took a while, but it definitely walks you through all the incremental elements of any EDRMS project. You can have more going on here, especially migration and stuff like that, but you can't have less. There really cannot be any less than this. So this is the Gantt chart. It's a little rough around the edges, but it gets the job done. Here are the same tasks, the total effort among all the actors, and the progression of tasks as we go through, including all the necessary requisite dependencies. And yes, of course, we here at RimTech, we typically do this in Microsoft Project. What about the costs? Well, the costs are going to come from billable professional services from your SharePoint services provider, from someone like us, if you choose to use someone like us, and from the records software vendor, mostly in training and setup, little else. And you're going to have some hard costs, namely software. So this particular model I'm showing you here is fictional, but it's a duplicate of one we prepared for a real live client. It's a small municipality with a couple of hundred employees. So the total cost worked out to about 170K, 58,000 to the SharePoint services provider, 74 to someone like us, 4,500 to the records software vendor, and 10,000 in the hard costs. Okay, not too bad, not too bad at all. So let's go back to the presentation here. So we've seen this, we've seen it live. So now let's talk about Catalyst for a moment. Catalyst is a set of tools we built specifically to speed up the deployment and make it more accurate. Because no matter what, we have to avoid those two lethal threats. Remember? Number one, case records, got to get it right. Number two is we have to prove objectively every single day that we're above 85% classification accuracy. Because if we're below that number, no self-respecting records manager will ever proceed with a disposition to blow away 1 million or 2 million or 3 million documents at a time. And if we cannot do that disposition, we have failed. There is no EDRMS project. It's dead. That's the whole idea of EDRMS, is to destroy massive amounts of records in accordance with that retention schedule. So what is Catalyst? It's not a piece of software. It's not. They are helper tools for deployment, and only for deployment, and only to SharePoint, not to document, not to content manager, not to M files, only for SharePoint, okay? And there's three main components. One is a retention schedule. Yeah, we have a full retention schedule for municipalities. Is that any good if you're an airline manufacturer? Yes, because of those 2,200 or so categories, 600 to 800 are generic. So it might not be a full machine readable retention schedule for you, but it can be at least a half, which is a big start. For a municipality, we've got it covered, ready to go right out of the box. 2,200 categories for any municipality in North America. You should be able to just run with that. Second is we have the SharePoint IA. 2,200 libraries, 30,000 column assignments, 2,200 column types, content types, sorry. There's no such thing as a column type. Oh, actually there is. And we have 1,000 plus term store entries. Those are the lists, like lists of buildings, list of vehicles, list of employees, right? But they're all fake. They're all placeholders. You have to edit them and put in your vehicle numbers, your employee names, and your building numbers, right? And we have a data loader. This is a tool that takes the IA, the SharePoint IA, which is in a spreadsheet format, and it deploys it overnight. Yeah, let me say that again. It deploys it overnight. That's saving you months, in some cases, years of work. It's a service. It is not a piece of software. As I said, I can't make that point strongly enough. We will never give this to you. It's not a piece of software. It's a service that we run remotely on your behalf. Now, there's more than just those three components. These are all helper tools to help the entire process. This is a kind of a roadmap of the process that we typically go through for a brand new client. What does it take to use these tools? How does it work? Well, uh, if we start from scratch, we have to interview users to find out what they do to build the retention schedule. Then we have to convert that retention schedule through transcription into what we call a metadata map, which is that spreadsheet that defines the SharePoint IA. Then we test it, validate it, and then we hand it over to Catalyst, and Catalyst deploys it overnight. Okay, so this whole process we've done many, many times. You might not have to do it. If you're a municipality, we've already done it for you. Okay. Anyway, there's four components, or what we call artifacts. There's a retention category detail artifact. There's a metadata map. There's a SharePoint deployment map, which shows you everything that's been deployed under the hood in SharePoint, and there's a retention schedule. So I'll just show you a short example of each of the four. Here's the RCD. It's a title, a description, metadata, and retention rules for one category in the retention schedule. It's a Word document, but it's very explicit. It shows us everything we need to know for the next step, which is the IA. Here's the retention schedule. It's machine readable. So if you look at the right-hand side, you'll see that the language is field, operator, value, and then the retention rule is a trigger, a rule type, period of time, units of measure, and what's going to happen at the end of the life cycle. That's machine readable, okay? Which it has to be in order to load it into any record software. This is the metadata map. So if you can imagine in your mind 800 categories and 14 metadata fields, that's what this looks like, 11,200 rows. And you have one row in this spreadsheet contains all the details about one column usage. Where is it? Is it mandatory or optional? How long is it? Is it shared or not? That kind of thing. Now, the SharePoint deployment map is what have we created? We have SharePoint up and running, but what does it contain? How does it behave? That's what this is. One sheet is a PDF and one sheet for each library in SharePoint. And it tells you everything you needed to know about that library, what metadata is there, what retention rules being applied to it, the description and the name of that retention rule, and some statistics about the data or the metadata. Okay? So there's no way to do that with native SharePoint, not easily anyway. So that's an 800-page document, and it tells you everything in exquisite detail what's going on under the hood in SharePoint. This is a list of columns, which are how many unique columns do we have? I would guess 500, 600 maybe. And where are they being used, and what's the difference between them all? This is the term store, which is the lists. So typically you get 20% of 800, you get 160, you have between 1 and 200 lists typically. So here we see some agreement types, asset types, business units. You got to have business units, right? Like insurance, finance, IT, what have you. And we have good, useful statistics to show how efficient the system is when it's deployed. So we return back now to this diagram. We've already seen this a couple times, but there's no way to avoid it. There are 6 steps you have to go through, okay? These 6 steps are embodied in the 36 tasks that we looked at earlier in the project model. So if you choose, they're all manual, but if you choose, you can use Catalyst and we can completely, if you're a municipality, we completely wipe out step 4. It's done. You just have to modify the list and off you go. You could be up and running in a day if you're a municipality. If you're not a municipality, you can't use all 2,200, but you can probably use up to 800, which is half the job, so you're in good shape. Step 5 is completely eliminated. This is manually creating the SharePoint information architecture. Big job done by IT, could take months, completely gone. Step 6 is where you have to go to that record keeping software, whatever you purchase, and create 2,400 rules. We estimate that'll take 75 days of work on average. 75 days. Those rules don't drop out of the sky. Believe me, you have to work and create them. That's the bad news. The good news is once they're up and running, they work 24 hours a day. Your system is automatically classifying and declaring records 24 hours a day without any user intervention and guaranteeing 85% or higher accuracy too. So it's worth the effort. The 75 days is a good investment. Next year, 2026, we are going to automate this process completely with Catalyst. by deploying those rules from the IA automatically. Now, what is an IDP? As industry deployment package, we only have one today, which is municipalities, but it contains your full retention schedule, your full SharePoint IA, and a tool to get it up and running in no time. Like you could literally get up and running in a week or less if you didn't want to change anything. But if you want to do some adjustments, which is typical, then you could get up and running in less than a month and huge cost savings. So that's it. Please check us out for further information about this. We have training courses on all aspects of EDRMS, including deployment, product-specific training, how to build those retention schedules, um, you name it. We have something like 26 courses, and we also have a growing family of YouTube videos for education. So be sure to check out our Catalyst RIM site, our Catalyst website, our RIMTech website, and our YouTube channel. And thank you very much for attending. I appreciate it.